Real quick before we start, I want to announce a live stream we're having on this channel tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Another YouTuber, Mr. Reagan, will be joining us to discuss things like politics, SJW culture, and AOC and more. Come on back to No Bullshit tomorrow night at 6 and you guys can check it out too. It's going to be a great time. But for now, let's get into the show. Hello and welcome back to No Bullshit. Today we're talking about more anti-white propaganda coming from our least favorite news network, CNN. This time you're never going to believe what they're calling racist. The color of robots. Not kidding. This is not a drill, people. The liberal shills at CNN and their so-called researchers are suggesting there could be something called robot racism. Here's the original tweet for reference, which is still posted and upheld by the official CNN Twitter account. I'm pretty baffled with this level of stupidity, guys. Let's read the tweet anyway, though, just so we can be fair. It says, "Have you ever noticed the popularity of white robots? The reason for these shades of technological white may be racism, according to new research." Well, I'm going to have to go ahead and press X for doubt on that one, guys. I'm not really sure I can get behind the idea of robot racism at all. Robots and machines don't have a race, obviously. They're metal and plastic and electric parts, with little to no consciousness either. Needless to say, we're not in the movies here, people. And as for where I think this thing might be going, it's probably going to be something about robots tending to be white colored, and that's because everyone in the world has pro-white bias or something. That's my guess. Never mind the fact that most robots are purely white colored and also mechanical. And humans that are called white are rarely the actual color white, absolutely. Most whites are actually tan at least somewhat, making our skin more of a light brown if anything. Regardless, CNN says they have new research saying so-called robot racism may be a thing. So let's go ahead and check out that article then and see if they actually have a case here. Have you ever noticed the popularity of white robots? You see them in films like Will Smith's iRobot and Eve from WALL-E. Real-life examples include Honda's Asimo, UbTech's Walker, Boston Dynamics Atlas, and even NASA's Valkyrie robot. All made of shiny white material, and some real-life humanoid robots are modeled after white celebrities, such as Audrey Hepburn and Scarlett Johansson. The reason for these shades of technological white may be racism, according to new research. Robots and Racism, a study conducted by the Human Interface Technology Laboratory in New Zealand, and published by the country's University of Canterbury, suggests people perceive physically human-like robots to have a race, and therefore apply racial stereotypes to white and black robots. These colors have been found to trigger social cues that determine how robots react to and behave toward other people and also, apparently, robots. Okay, let's go ahead and
slow things down right there.
There are a few leaps in logic here I want to address. First of all, robots are robots. They're not people. So having a preference for white as a color for robots is not racist against anyone. There actually has to be a victim for there to be actual racism here. I think the assumption here is that if you pick white as the color for your robot, you are then racist against people who are not white like that. I think that's where this is going, and it's absolutely absurd, of course. This is like saying if you pick a white-colored dog from the pound, that shows your preference for white people, which then also means ipso facto you're racist against people who aren't white, like your dog. I say no. This is a dipshit response to that idea, and people just pick the colors of their dogs or the robots because it's a color and they like the look of it. And this has nothing to do with racial biases against other people either. Next, let's talk about having in-group bias for a minute. Part of this argument here is saying that if you're white and you prefer white things like you, that's inherently wrong, biased, and even racist. This is not true though, and it would probably not be a claim made against people of any other race. If blacks ended up buying black cars or bicycles more, do you think CNN would call them out for being racist? Not a chance, and this is because it's not racist to prefer colors on certain things, even if the preference for that color is influenced by your own color or race. Keep in mind, racism is the belief that your race is superior, and also it means you're biased against other races in a negative, discriminatory way. So even if you take this robot racism argument at face value here and say that picking a color for your robot shows your preference for colors like your own skin, well, that doesn't prove that you think your race is superior though, and it doesn't prove you're biased against other races either. Needless to say, there's a lot of assumptions and guesswork being had here, but I think what I've said already debunks this whole thing pretty well. The bias against black robots is a result of bias against African Americans. Lead researcher Christoph Bartnet explained to the Next Web. He told CNN, "It is amazing to see how people who had no prior interaction with robots show racial bias towards them. The researchers think this is an issue that needs to be addressed. If robots are supposed to function as teachers, friends, or carers, for instance, then it will be a serious problem if all of these roles are only ever occupied by robots that are racialized as white," according to the study. This researcher sounds like a crazy person. He's clearly a biased SJW-influenced individual for sure. And that also means this whole study and premise is now suspect. This wasn't coming from a non-biased, serious, professional, science experiment level situation. No, this whole robot racism bullshit idea is coming from a radical left-wing PC-pushing SJW. And we'll get more into this Christoph Bartnet guy soon too, but first, let's talk about these horrendous quotes some more here. Bias against black robots is not a result of bias against African Americans. Of course it isn't, for a myriad of reasons. As I went over already, color choices for your robots, cars, or pets isn't really related to race or how a person judges other races. Then we also already went over how in-group preference isn't inherently racist or bad either. It's actually perfectly natural and super common. But now, let's go over how your preference for one thing doesn't mean you're biased against another. Just because I pick a Pepsi soda doesn't automatically mean I hate Coke. I could like both almost the same, but given a choice, you do have to pick one or the other. So even if we give them the benefit of the doubt here and connect people's color choices to racial preferences, that preference doesn't make you racist against everyone who doesn't fall into it. It's kind of like the argument against racial preferences in dating, if you think about it more. Both claims are just as wrong though. Having dating preferences is your right, and you should be allowed to pick your robot's color without being called a racist as well. For example, if you know someone who, say, only dates Hispanic brown men, that doesn't necessarily mean that person hates all other men. They just like the Latin ones more, and they know what they like, so why even try dating other dudes and wasting their time? Now, there always could be a racist reason behind someone's dating preferences, but that's not usually true or certainly true in most cases. At least with dating though, there are actual humans and races involved. And sometimes even, there are some people who are racist and don't date a certain race because of that. But with the robot racism question, this suggestion is even more ridiculous. Maybe there's one or two people out there that really hate another race, so they won't pick a robot of that color, but that's certainly not prevalent or relevant to the real world at all. Next, let's finish things up by moving on to a video I found by this researcher, the one behind this racist robot study. Christoph Bartnet is his name again, and he's got a YouTube channel and everything. His video is called "That's a Bit Racist Robots." Check this bullshit out.
He was looking for an image of a brown robot, and he couldn't find any.
That is a bit racist.
One of the problems that you have when you study racism is that you cannot directly ask the question that you're most interested in. If you go to a person and ask him, "Hey, are you a racist?" most likely they will say, "No, of course not, I'm not a racist."
Well, that's because most people are not racist, dude. Not in current year, at least. Just because SJWs like you think everyone is racist doesn't mean that's actually true. In fact, if that was true and everyone was racist and had inherent biases, well, it's not really that wrong of a thing to be, is it? If every person on the planet is one thing, we should pretty much accept that thing and admit it's a natural thing for humans to be. So racism in a negative sense should really mean the rare cases where people are actually biased against other races. And when they actually do bad things because of that, like say, fire someone from a job, beat them up, or put them in jail because of their race. But the fact that most robots are white is hardly one of these cases. Just because you couldn't find a picture of a brown robot? What a joke. And has it ever occurred to this idiot that maybe this is happening because many plastics like nylon or fiberglass, well, they are naturally white in color, and they're what's used to make these robots. So if the materials used to make robots are naturally white, and then they end up being white too, then that's making this even less about people making a choice that is white. There's also the fact that it's harder to see darker colored things. So dark browns and blacks would make robots and their parts much harder to see. And those are just a few non-race related reasons why these machines tend to be that color. This wannabe ancient aliens guy here thinks this is all because of racism, because he's actually the one biased against everyone else.
We use the very well-established shooter bias study as a way to investigating these kind of racial biases. And the way it works is that you put the participant of these experiments in the role of a police officer. And this participant then gets to see an image for a fraction of a second. And this would either be a person that has a gun in his or her hand.
Wow, just wow. I gotta say, this kind of study doesn't seem too scientific and conclusive to me, and I wouldn't be using the term racist to describe the conclusions drawn from this. Perhaps they found some people who had some bias, but it's not evil, malignant bias like what racism is really about, and it's also just absurd on so many other levels that we already went over. Most of it, though, amounts to an in-group bias, which, as we went over before, is not inherently racist or wrong. It's actually perfectly natural and super common. For example, if these studies were done in African countries with a black majority of people, you would find their in-group biases would make them prefer blacks like themselves, and then also reject whites and others. And I wouldn't hold that against them either. But these studies, of course, are being promoted and conducted from New Zealand, a place with a great white majority. So naturally, white people's in-group preferences would be the opposite of Africans. So I say maybe, just maybe, people relate more to their own people and skin color. And that's why they see them as safer and are less likely to shoot them in a study that's done like this one in the video. But this does not make people racist though. And the methodology used here in this stupid study, to a large extent, none of this should be regarded as actual scientific research at all. So people like this really should stop crying racist at everything. And this so-called scientist should find a real problem to work on solving. In the end, robots and their colors, of course, are not racist. And the real reason most robots are white is probably more to do with the building materials and the fact that the color is brighter and easier to see. But if you go down the racially biased route, there is another explanation for why there are more white robots. People make the robots white because they prefer white things like themselves. Well, that's still not wrong or racist on its own, as we said before. But it also proves a much harsher truth here. This means that more white people are making more robots and paying for them and building them. So take that as you will, but I think we all know there aren't lots of robots and breakthrough technology coming out of the war-torn continent of Africa. They still have people living in huts and caves over there. So saying there are more white robots in the world because of racial biases kind of points out the fact that whites are more likely to be the ones making robots. Whether or not that's because we're smarter or more successful is still to be determined, but one thing I know for certain is that's not the kind of conclusion this Christoph crazy-haired nutbar was going for. But hey, you know what? There's another thing to remember here. Most toilets in the world are white, so that's something else we could think about. What do you guys think? Are there more white robots in the world because of racism? Or is it because of the materials they are built with or the seeability of the color white? Comment your thoughts on everything below, and thanks for watching No Bullshit. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and we'll see y'all next time.